Hello everyone and welcome back to another instalment of the Warwick F1 Show. We are going to be, it's just been a couple of weeks since we have seen the Belgium Grand Prix and now F1 is out for the summer break, and we thought in this episode we would sit down to have a look at the season so far. How have the races been as we have seen them as of yet, with the different races, the different winners we've had, and discuss a little bit before we go into our next race at Zandvoort in a few weeks' time. I am joined once again by Will Kingswood and returning guest Oscar, and we have also had some questions sent in by our society, which we're going to discuss through in a little moment, just to see how our opinions, I suppose, differ from our viewers as such. But first of all, I wanted to ask you guys how you think the season has been so far in comparison to other seasons. I suppose we probably automatically know that we're going to probably rate this season a bit higher than last season, given the absolute dominance we saw from Verstappen, but more so just compared to many seasons in the past. Where do we think exactly, if I come to you, Will, first, where do we think exactly this season sits in comparison to the ones that we've seen before?
Well, I think if I had to describe it in one word, it would probably be unique, in that I think after probably the first four or five races, we were all thinking it's going to be very similar to 2023. We're going to see Max Verstappen winning a lot of races. It will just be 2023 part two. But then over from about May onwards, all the races kind of coming into Europe, we've actually reached a point where we kind of don't know who's going to be the fastest and who's going to win any one race. And I think that's made the season far more interesting than a lot of other seasons we've seen in the past. Obviously, we had 2023 and 2022 quite Verstappen dominated. 2021 very unique in terms of its title battle between Verstappen and Hamilton. But then going back into the 2010s, we kind of saw one or maybe two teams dominating at once. But now we've got McLaren, we've got Mercedes, we've got Ferrari, and we've got Red Bull with Max Verstappen, all of whom could potentially go to a race and potentially win it. And I think while maybe that dominance from Verstappen at the start of the season has kind of secured his title for him, because now it's very much everyone taking points off one another, each individual race is these days really quite interesting. I don't think we've had one recently that has been a bit boring, maybe with the exception of Monaco, but that's kind of how Monaco tends to go. So yeah, this has been a much better season, a much more interesting season than I think any of us were thinking it would be, any of us giving it credit for. And I think that's likely to continue once we do get to the end of the summer break.
I certainly can't think of any particular season in mind that's had this many race winners or this many contenders at each and every race we've been to. Each race certainly recently has felt like, I was going to say both Red Bulls, but particularly Verstappen, and both McLarens, both Mercedes, and you really can't guess who it's going to be. Oscar, what's your take on it? Would you kind of agree with Will and I in the sense that it's been a very unique season in terms of the sheer number of race winners and race contenders that we have in each race, or would you maybe prefer other seasons in the past?
Yeah, I think F1 in general, like compared to the last two seasons, is obviously a lot better than, where it was. And I totally agree with you guys, because everything happening off track as well, also driver movements, those sorts of things are adding to the fire almost to make it a really interesting season. But I also think that some of the dramas are playing a part in making this series, pretty interesting again. Like Sergio Perez at Red Bull, he's not had a great season, and it's brought other teams back into the fight, which is so that there's definitely reason to be excited now for the future of F1 going forward and for the rest of the season, because it's the proof that now with these new cars that they've hoped would work for so long, there is now closer racing, and the racing's closer than it's ever been. So it's been great to watch.
I noticed there as well, you did say the past two seasons better than that, and I think I would agree in that sense that I think 2021 does slightly pip it a little bit, which is not to say obviously we've had more race winners this season, but I guess 2021 you had the I guess you could say, the holy grail of F1, which is a title fight from start to finish. And that's, as Will said, that's not exactly what we've had this season. Verstappen's dominance at the start of the season in races like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia have probably now secured him at least the Drivers' Championship. But we'll get on to discussing that a little bit more in this episode. But so that's our general opinions, I suppose, of how the season's gone so far and why we're certainly looking forward to the second half of the season. But we'll now go into some of the questions that we've had sent in from our society. And a lot of the opinions of the society centered around, I think, our surprising race winners we've had so far. A lot of people mainly saying, obviously, Hamilton with his brilliant race in Silverstone and his return now twice to the top step of the podium with that race in Belgium, although he didn't actually get to stand on the top step of the podium at the time. We've had first race wins from Norris and Piastri, Leclerc's win at home. But overall, the question I have for you guys is, what would you say has been the best race win this season out of all of the ones we've had? Quite a difficult question, as we've had loads of good ones. Well, I can probably guess what yours is going to be, but that's completely fair enough, because if it is, I do agree with you in this sense.
No, I think it does kind of, for me, have to be Hamilton at Silverstone. I think the fact is, like, it's 2.5 years, obviously, since Hamilton's last win. You're coming into the start of the season, and Mercedes have brought a car that is, again, maybe the fourth fastest on the grid, and just kind of that development, and it was getting closer and closer. And then obviously with it was a good weekend for the British drivers, regardless of kind of the result. We had that British 1-2-3 in qualifying. We potentially could have had that 1-2-3 in the race if Russell hadn't retired. But just those final few laps where, like, you've kind of got the ever-present threat of Max Verstappen, who for the last 2 years has been about as dominant as a driver can get, kind of closing in. It's like, will Hamilton be able to hold on kind of for that win? And obviously he was able to do so, and especially it being in front of the home crowd as well. I think that made it a lot more special, kind of marking a little bit of a return from what has ultimately been probably Hamilton's worst period in terms of results of his career. I mean, other than that, I think you've got to mention Leclerc at Monaco as well, kind of overcoming that Monaco curse. I think winning his first race at the track, and really, like, that was probably elevated as well by the commentary. I know Alex Jakes did one of probably the most iconic kind of monologues as he was coming around the final lap there. And I think it is ultimately just special to win your home race, and especially for Leclerc, who had, like, and just the journey he's been on in F1. So I think those two would probably be the two I'd pick for kind of the best wins of the season. But I think there's a lot of choices here in terms of what you want to pick, not just from Leclerc and Hamilton, but from a lot of the other drivers as well.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that as well. I think the kind of, it felt almost like a fairy tale ending to that win at Silverstone. It felt incredibly special for Hamilton, as we've said, because of the weight that he's had to endure from it, because it's at the home race. Everything just sort of fell into place, and as well you could see what it meant to him. It's kind of the reason, I think I said at the time, why we can appreciate the sport so much, is because it means so much to the drivers who are competing, and it felt incredibly special to be able to witness it. I think just from, even if you're a Hamilton fan, if you're not a Hamilton fan, I think everyone just had to feel great for him. Oscar, would you agree with that? If not, what kind of race really sticks in your mind as a great race win this season?
The one that sticks in my mind particularly well, or maybe this because I'm friends with, like, pretty much all Lando fans, but that first Lando Norris win in Miami really sticks out to me, because it was more like he's going around and you're like, can he really do it? You know, he's always had this nickname, you know, somewhat harshly put upon him of, you know, that he couldn't win a race and always Russia being held over his head, but he did it, and he did it with some style. And before that, I remember the previous year in Miami, he'd have that really awful crash where he lost like all the wheels on his car. So to come back and do that, it really sticks out to me as just one race that like, you know, that I wouldn't forget from this season.
Yeah, certainly at the time, it definitely felt very special, and probably the most special race I suppose you could think of. And for me, until that Silverstone race, but as we said, for a lot of people, got certainly a lot of Norris fans out there as people who went to Silverstone saw how popular he is amongst the British fans. And we've all been waiting for that first race win for definitely a couple of years. So I definitely say that is another great one as well. Sticking though with the theme of Hamilton, though, we obviously know that I think a big part of the theme around Hamilton and his success story back with Mercedes is also kind of overshadowed in a way by the fact that he's leaving next season. And he's obviously, as we know, he's moving to Ferrari next season. And by the looks of things now, did he make a mistake? That's my next question. Do you think that it was right to move to Ferrari? Oscar, if we come to you first, do we think that he made a wrong decision to move to Ferrari, or has he got more potential there?
I'd say for the future, no, because I think with Ferrari, you know, obviously he's going to be in a team that will be going for the constructors, obviously, and they will be a strong team. Him and Leclerc are going to be one of the best driver pairings on the grid. And I think kind of a competitive edge, you know, Hamilton, I think, will benefit from being able to compete against someone like that in a car. And as well, I think Ferrari would be, in my mind, would be better at making engines. So if we're thinking to 2026, you know, the Ferrari engine, it's powerful, it's quick, and Mercedes have made mistakes in the past with their development. So to me, it's why should Hamilton trust them again when they have failed him for a couple of years? Because he doesn't want to be sitting there in a car that may be around it. He wants to go straight to the top. And with Red Bull starting to maybe, you know, crack at the seams, you know, despite the McLaren and obviously Mercedes issues recently, I don't think he would have moved there unless he was absolutely 100% convinced that they would be making something absolutely incredible for him. I can't lie.
Well, certainly, I think as you mentioned, from the new regulations that came in, Mercedes have almost had to play catch up for the last couple of years until really only this season. And as you say, maybe Ferrari do look better, especially if Adrian Newey ends up going there, and then they are looking potentially as a real threat for seasons coming. Will, what's your take on it?
I think you've got to think about when the decision was made. Like, he made it over kind of the winter break going into 2024. At that point, Ferrari kind of looking like that second best team, maybe Mercedes a bit lower down. Obviously, as that's played out, maybe Mercedes have got a bit further ahead, but I guess it really depends on what kind of Lewis Hamilton wants from what ultimately probably will be the final few years of his career. This gives him that opportunity to kind of fulfill a boyhood dream of driving for Ferrari. And let's be honest, like, Ferrari aren't a bad team at the moment. They're probably have fallen away a little bit compared to Mercedes and McLaren and Red Bull. But, I mean, as Oscar was saying, next year they're going to have Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc in those two seats. It will probably be the strongest driver lineup on the grids. And Ferrari do tend to come out of the gate quite well, as we've seen for the last few years. And I think especially Hamilton as well, he has that relationship with Fred Vasseur. It is kind of a return to the very, very early stages of his career back in GP2, when for ART they worked together. And I think that there obviously might be a little bit of regret, especially if Mercedes continue on like the path that they're going on, that they are improving and that he has taken a few wins. But for Hamilton, these will be kind of really nice wins that he'll be able to go out of Mercedes on a high note, as opposed to maybe a 2023 or 2022 when he hasn't been as successful. He'll be able to go out of Mercedes on a high note. He'll have a final few years as a swan song at Ferrari, and realistically, it will be a Ferrari that will be challenging for podiums, that will be challenging for wins. And then you never know what teams are going to bring in 2025. And it could be the case that Mercedes bring a great car. They could bring a car that drops back. Ferrari could bring a great car, or a car that drops back. You don't know. And you have to make these decisions with a bit of a risk in mind. Like Hamilton's done that. He moved from McLaren to Mercedes when Mercedes was still a kind of more of a midfield team in 2013, and obviously it paid off. And maybe he takes that risk, maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't, but he gets that opportunity to drive in a Ferrari for the final years of his career. So I wouldn't say that there is probably any regret at the moment. If he can compete for that 8th world title, then it will look like the decision's paid off once again.
Do you think that he has more of a chance going to Ferrari in getting that 8th world title, or is it difficult to say because of how variable we know that these teams can be? Ferrari seem to have a habit of going backwards throughout the season, I must say. They've kind of done that a little bit this season. I remember they did that in 2018 as well. And are they maybe still a little bit too far off yet? Or is it a better chance than Mercedes?
I wouldn't say it's more of a chance, because I think what you've got still is a Red Bull. At the moment, obviously, the rumours kind of circulating, but at the moment, you've got Red Bull with Max Verstappen, who is probably the best driver, or the most consistent driver on the grid at the moment. You'll have a McLaren team with a Lando Norris that will hopefully have ironed out maybe some of the mistakes that he's made, with an Oscar Piastri who is looking like he's on his way up in the sport, some really consistent results over the past few races. You obviously have Mercedes and Russell, and you'll have his teammate Charles Leclerc in Ferrari. I don't think that he'll have less of a chance. I don't think at the moment he'll have more of a chance. I think he'll have about the same chance, and there'll be a lot of other drivers that will be competing for it. And if we do see kind of these trends of 2024 bleed into 2025, we're going to end up with a driver's title that is probably contested by about 5 or 6 drivers, and that you never know where that could end up at that point. We'll see another 2012, another 2010, where any one team, maybe any one race, could win. And I think that if we get something like that, any driver's got a chance of winning the world title, not just Lewis Hamilton.
Certainly, if how it's been over the last few races continues into next season, it'll be very exciting. But we're going to have to wait until next year to see whether Hamilton has made the decision to go into a faster car or not. But we'll move it on. So now we're thinking as a question about who has been the best driver this season. Now, the person who sent this in thought that Hülkenberg actually deserves more credit, and I'm inclined to agree with it as well. I'm not sure if he's been the best driver this season as such, but Oscar, if we come to you first, who do you think has been the best driver this season? Not just in their car in terms of points, but just purely on driver merit. Would you put Hülkenberg up there, or would you go with someone else?
I would not go with Hülkenberg. I would probably go with Lando Norris, because honestly, he's done everything to kind of prove, what a brilliant driver he continues to be. Obviously he had to let pass Piastri in Hungary, but I'm sure there are plenty of drivers on the grid where even after all the consulting that was done with him during that race, he would have done that. And obviously his first win, he's up there, he's competing for the top pretty much every race now. And even though McLaren don't always come out the blocks fastest, he's putting in good effort and good finishes to catch up. I mean, there's just a load of podiums, and good results across the board. The reason why I don't go with Hülkenberg is because he outperforming what he has and also beating his teammate quite consistently. I would say absolutely, yeah. But I think as much as I love the guy, he's still behind Lance Stroll, so there's still a lot I think there's.
I wondered
there's
how far into the episode it would take for you to mention Lance Stroll, but
yeah, I'm sure we'll mention him in more detail later. But obviously he's doing well. But is he the best?
So you think he needs to exceed a little bit more if he was to get the credit of, or that title, I suppose, of being the best driver so far?
Yeah, if he could go ahead of the Astons, I think you could say quite comfortably he was the best.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I must be honest, I was very surprised that you said Lando Norris. I did not expect that at all. Only because I think of I can just think of a few mistakes that he has made this season, but certainly he's been very strong. He continues to show that he's an amazing talent, and we can certainly expect, I think, big things for him in the second half of the season. I was actually thinking more across the garage to his teammate Oscar Piastri. I don't know what Will thinks about that, whether he'd go with something completely different. What would you think?
I would go for Max, realistically. I think...
Really?
Yeah.
This is nothing that I was expecting.
I think if you look out, I accept completely the last two races for Max haven't been the best, but I think that ultimately he's been able to secure this world title. Not obviously, I mentioned the dominance earlier in the season when he was able to win, I think, 4 of the first 5 races and didn't really have that much competition. But when the competition has kind of crept up to Red Bull, crept up to their level, he's still found ways to win at a number of races, and if not win, be up there to be competing for points when maybe other drivers who could have had a chance to compete with him, and I think Lando Norris is a prime example of that, could have had a chance to compete with him, have been making those mistakes. You look to Spain, where Max, maybe not in the fastest car, was able to compete and get that win. Canada, I think, is another example that I didn't mention in the best wins that I think ultimately might be one of Max's best wins since 2021, in that he really had to compete with Norris, with Russell, and was able to come out on top and was able to not make any mistakes on a day that was really difficult driving, or that had really difficult driving conditions. And I think that if you like, the mark of a world champion is that consistency, and I think he's displaying that in ultimately a car that isn't probably the fastest anymore and hasn't maybe been the fastest for some time, and especially when you compare it to his teammate Sergio Perez, who has really not been performing. I think the fact that Max is always a question, it's always a question of, will Max be able to compete for the win? It's like we kind of always have him in a guaranteed person who might be able to compete for the win, and I think that just shows that he is probably having the best season. And I honestly don't think anyone's had a perfect season. I think everyone's struggled at certain points of the season. I think Max ultimately has just struggled the least and has been able to be the most consistent, and is going to reap the benefits of that at the end of the season, when he'll probably win the world title for the 4th time.
Yeah, well, certainly, I do agree with you there that there has definitely been moments where everyone has been off. I would say, I think, as I mentioned, definitely Lando Norris has made a couple of mistakes throughout the season. Even the person I was going to go with, Oscar Piastri, we had, I think, a couple of episodes where we were mentioning how we might be having a bit of a dip in form. And that's obviously probably one of the reasons why we've had so many different race winners this season, is because everyone hasn't really been amazing throughout the entire season. But you're right in the sense, what I was going to come on to is, if Sergio Perez has taught us one thing, is that Red Bull car is not as dominant in any way, shape, or form as what we saw last season. And so the fact that Max can still put in those performances, as you said, still score points when that Red Bull car is not up to the job, has shown the reason why he is ultimately a 3-time world champion, because he is a very good racing driver and has a lot of talent. And I think, in a way, Verstappen, probably the reason I didn't actually think of him is I think he's maybe gone under the radar a little bit with the different race winners. Obviously, when Verstappen takes a win, we don't really notice it as much as maybe Norris or Piastri because we're less used to that occurrence compared to Verstappen winning. But I think maybe after you saying that and upon new thought, I think Verstappen definitely has gone under the radar in his good performances this season, especially the fact that he was able to get up there at the end of Belgium from 11th place, and in comparison with his teammate for sure. Now we come to the point of the episode where we go over Oscar's message sent into the society regarding Lance Stroll. So you pointed out that Stroll had points at Silverstone, but it did make me think. I did want to talk about Stroll a little bit because we don't often discuss him that much on the podcast. But do you think Stroll has been good enough this season? And if that is the case, do you think maybe the hate surrounding him is a little bit undeserved? Or do you think it's justified? Or the criticism, I should say. How do you think his standards have been this season, maybe compared to where he has been last season and maybe where he should be with the performances of, say, Fernando Alonso and what that Aston Martin car is capable of?
Yeah, with regard to the conversation around Stroll, like, I get it. Like, I get why people will often say that. But if I had to describe Lance Stroll's season so far, I would put in the word of inconsistent. The Aston Martin hasn't been maybe what I had hoped it to be. It's not the most competitive car as it were previous seasons, but he's still able to get good, consistent points. Obviously, he's no Fernando Alonso. I won't pretend that he's anywhere close to that guy's skill set, but there's things. There are positive results in there. Some good points in Canada, Australia, and Silverstone, and he just seems to be, he's either scoring a decent chunk of points, inside the top 10, or he's absolutely nowhere. One thing I will say he's done quite well is he's cut out a lot more of the crashing. He's driving a bit safer, if that is the right word for it. But yeah,
I get what you mean.
I think he can do with being more consistent, that's for sure. But if he's only one place behind his teammate, I don't think that's the end of the world for the team. And it's not like, it's not like a type of Red Bull situation or a Haas situation where the two teammates are just so far off each other now that it's getting a bit ridiculous, you could argue. But yeah, that's kind of where I stand. But I totally get why people maybe aren't as keen on him as I am, certified Lance super fan, if you will.
Yes, we definitely all know that, but yeah, I can see what you mean in regards to the inconsistency. And we certainly know what Lance Stroll is capable of. He's put in some great performances, I think, over the past couple of years. Obviously, we know that podium that he got. I think was it in Azerbaijan with Williams or something like that. And so we know he can perform on the day, but yeah, I think he just needs to be a little bit more consistent. And also, it is quite difficult having a two-time world champion as your teammate, and so you're always going to be unfortunately compared to your teammate, and there's no way that he can be expected, I think, to put up against someone like Fernando Alonso. Will, would you agree with that? With Lance Stroll, I think he just needs to work a bit more on the consistency as such.
Yeah, I don't actually think Stroll's had that bad of a season. I think, I was just looking through the standing or the kind of the race results, and since Imola, he's matched Alonso points wise. I think Alonso scored 16 points, Stroll scored 15. The big difference is from the start of the season, where Aston Martin did have a better car and probably were able to compete for points a bit more. I think the problem that a lot of the midfield teams at the moment have got is that on any normal day, 8 of the points positions are gone already. So you're competing for 9th and 10th, which ultimately are only two. It is only 2 and 1 points respectively. I think at the start of the season, when the order was shaken up a bit more, you were seeing the Aston Martin able to compete for kind of those bigger points positions, and I think Alonso was able to grab those points positions more, which for me accounts for most of the gap that we see between the two drivers in terms of the standings. But outside of that and into the last few races, I think Stroll has easily been matching Alonso, and I think even at some races has been better than the world or the double world champion. And I don't know if that's Alonso has maybe kind of regressed a little bit in terms of his abilities. Has Stroll improved? Has that Aston? I mean, we know that Aston Martin's been kind of all over the place in terms of its pace over the last few races. But I don't, this is by no means Stroll's worst ever season. I don't think we'll ever see, I think his peak was probably the first half of 2020, actually up until his crash in Mugello. And then after, into the second half of 2020, we kind of saw Stroll get quite unlucky with some of the results. And we've seen flashes of brilliance in the past. We've seen that podium with Williams, as you mentioned, in Azerbaijan, his front row start in Italy, I think a year later, and obviously his performance in Turkey in 2020 when he was comfortably, or he put it on pole and was comfortably leading the race for the first few, about the first half of the race until we kind of saw him get some damage, and which kind of put paid to his race. But I do think it is that consistency. But in a car that maybe isn't consistent itself at the moment, it is a bit difficult. But I think he's not done much to silence the critics, but I think he's done enough to kind of keep the criticism where it's at, keep the same level. And I don't think he's done anything that it warrants any more criticism than maybe he has currently.
Yeah, we should obviously take into account as well that the Aston Martin car probably hasn't been where the people at the team would favourably see it, but he's still in the top 10 in the in the drivers' championship, behind obviously the top 4 teams and his teammate Fernando Alonso. So I think certainly it hasn't been his worst season by any means. He just needs to again work on that kind of consistency if he's going to take if him and Alonso are going to take Aston Martin, I think, anywhere further forward in the field, which they don't look like they are going to yet, but we never know in seasons to come. But at the moment, they're certainly in a very lonely 5th position. We'll move on to the next question then. So this is more about title fights, as I was talking about kind of more at the start of the episode. We have so many drivers and teams that are very much performing and have shown that they can perform and win races in the first half of the season. Do we think that there is going to be any measure of a title fight in the second half of the season? And by that, I mean the Drivers' Championship or the Constructors' Championship. I'm sure we could probably more say now about the Constructors' Championship and talk definitely about a Constructors' fight, especially now that we know that Red Bull have decided to stay with Perez until the end of the season. So yeah, well, if we come to you first, will we see either of those title fights? And if so, what kind of form would that take?
I think constructors, absolutely. I think ultimately Red Bull, if assuming everything kind of stays the same, if the Red Bull's decision to keep Perez has, for me, lost them the constructors' battle, because as much as Max Verstappen is a brilliant driver, and as I've said, has been the best driver of the season for me, he won't be able to do enough against the McLarens, because McLaren have probably the best car. They've got two drivers who there's always going to be, I think, at least one of them is going to be performing. If it's not Piastri, it'll be Norris. And there will be days like in Hungary where they take a 1-2 and swing the gap, because if you get a 1-2, that's 43 points, And if Verstappen comes third, he gets 15. We think Perez gets 10 or less. That's another 20 points. And I think the gap is down. Well, the gap is down to about 40 points now. So I wouldn't be surprised if McLaren take the constructors lead in the next 5 races, to be honest. And I think they'll hold it for the rest of the season. I think drivers wise, it would have to take quite a bit of misfortune for Max Verstappen, and Lando Norris would need to iron out his mistakes. It would have to be a turnaround where both things happen, and even then, I still think it will be very unlikely that Verstappen won't be lifting kind of the world drivers title in Abu Dhabi, or realistically, probably I'd say maybe a race or two earlier. I wouldn't go he's not going to be winning it as early as he did in 2023. I think it would either come in Qatar, in Vegas, or maybe Brazil if Norris really has a poor second half of the season. But constructors, definitely, I think drivers, it's probably nailed on Max winning his 4th at the moment.
Oscar, does anyone challenge Max from what you can think in the second half of the season?
No, is the short answer to that. I totally agree with Will there on the drivers thing. It will be Max Verstappen to the end now, because even if he doesn't win maybe as many races as we're used to, he built a good gap so he can finish in and around it and just see it out now, pretty much. As for the constructors, yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for other teams to go for it. The Red Bull decision, obviously, that we've had recently makes you question why they would do that, but also it keeps the constructors fight on. And for a driver's fight, it would require Verstappen to be really off the pace, and Lando Norris or whoever else would be in and around there to be absolutely perfect, and Verstappen obviously to not be perfect himself. But yeah, there's totally a fight there that you can get excited about, I think, for the coming months of the rest of the season.
Verstappen is currently 78 points in front in the championship, ahead of Lando Norris in second place. And as we've said, it is quite difficult to see that gap is going to come down to, and meaning Lando Norris can go ahead at any point in the second half of the season, especially as we know how consistent Max Verstappen is. I mean, say what you want about him, we know he's been such a consistent driver this season, bar maybe Hungary, I would say. And we know he's going to get the max out of the car, no pun intended, from whatever pace that car can show. And we'll finish with one final question now, as we're getting close to 40 minutes. But we've heard recently in the news that Carlos Sainz next season has found a seat at Williams, replacing Logan Sargent. And that, to me, leaves one seat for next season, one major seat glaring open, which is the second Mercedes seat next to George Russell. So what are Mercedes going to do? Are they going to go with Kimi Antonelli? Are they going to look somewhere else for a drive? Who do we think will be there for 2025?
I mean,
I have absolutely no idea. I don't know what the answer to this question is.
It is a difficult one. My head says Antonelli. It just looks as though he's kind of being built up for the role. I think it would be he is obviously young, but I think next season, if we do see kind of what we're seeing at the moment, if we have got like 4 teams that realistically could be within a battle, it almost feels like maybe taking less of a risk on a rookie, because if everyone's taking points away from each other, it almost is at that point less of a risk, because it's not like potentially a 1-2 turns into a 1-6. At one race it could be a 4-5 turns into a 4-7, but at the next race it could be a 2-3 turns into a 2-4. I don't know if that logic works, but I think my head says Antonelli. Not my heart, but like the raw, like.
What does your heart say?
I don't think Verstappen's out of the question for that seat. I'm genuinely being honest. I think
it could be down to that. We know that recently. What's that? I think it was a Wheatley, which is he a technical race director. It all still maybe seems like it's coming apart at Red Bull. So maybe you never know.
Yeah, and like every bit of news coming out of Red Bull at the moment is negative for Red Bull. Obviously, you've got Wheatley leaving, the Horner kind of Fiat controversy continues to rumble on. Obviously, the rumours surrounding whether Perez was going to lose his seat, but then maybe F1 Liberty Media intervened to ensure that he wouldn't lose his seat. The Verstappens obviously are in one camp in terms of the Red Bull kind of over umbrella. Obviously, Horner is in another camp. You've just kind of got a lot of chaos, and as you're seeing Red Bull fall away, and realistically they are falling away in terms of their car performance, you wonder if Max Verstappen wants to jump ship and try something new. And it would be quite an insane move to go from Red Bull to Mercedes. It would probably be something like like Senna going from McLaren to Ferrari back.
Probably the most groundbreaking piece of news, I'd argue, since Hamilton going to Ferrari at least. Maybe even more than that.
Hamilton to Ferrari is very much he's in the back end of his career. He wants to drive for Ferrari because it's Ferrari kind of thing. Whereas this is a driver who is realistically in his prime, moving from one championship contending team to another championship contending team. And like it would be as if like back in the 2000s if Alonso had moved to Ferrari, and that's why I say like Senna going from McLaren to Ferrari is probably the most comparable move to it. But it just doesn't feel like it's out of the question at the moment. I think it could be a possibility, and I think you could maybe see Antonelli, especially, not that he isn't, I don't think, performing in F2, because as far as the results are coming out, he looks as though he is doing well. But if Mercedes don't think he's ready, it may make sense to keep him in F2, look for a drive in the midfield, and get Verstappen in. And I just think it might happen.
But this is the thing, because will Mercedes risk going with such an inexperienced driver? Especially as, obviously, you said that maybe it doesn't matter as much coming in if the pack is so mixed up. But then I guess equally you could say that if you have a more experienced driver in there who's able to get results, then Mercedes might be able to capitalize on the mix-up in the grid if you've got a more experienced driver in there. Even if you just bring in a driver for a couple of seasons until maybe Kimi Antonelli has a bit more experience in F2 or a midfield F1 team like you've just mentioned. So do you think maybe that would be ideally what Mercedes would go for, and Kimi Antonelli would kind of be their last resort in a way?
I think definitely. I think and the last time a driver went straight into a championship contending team on their debut was Lewis Hamilton back in 2007. And Hamilton was 22 or 23, so he had 4 years on Antonelli. I know the sport has kind of got younger in terms of the ages of the drivers that are now making their debut, but it is a risk. If they think Antonelli has the potential that Lewis Hamilton has, maybe it's a risk worth taking. But I almost think Mercedes have waited so long to make that decision because they are stuck between that rock and the hard place of, if they want to bring in Antonelli. If Hamilton had left in 2 years' time, it's probably perfect for Antonelli. But because he's leaving now, and Antonelli he might still be 17 or he's just turned 18, it is very early in his career to be putting him in a team that can ultimately win races, as we've seen over the past few weeks. And I don't know if Mercedes would want to take that risk. And maybe they would want to go for Verstappen. And I think that's the reason we've seen it take so long.
We've seen
concerned.
Yeah, and we've seen plenty of examples in F1 where I think maybe drivers have been rushed into seats when they're not ready, and it's ultimately destroyed not their maybe even their career hopes of actually getting to the point where they are fighting for race wins. I'm thinking of Nick de Vries at AlphaTauri. You could maybe argue Pierre Gasly when he was moved to Red Bull. Maybe even Alex Albon as well, to a little bit of a degree. Oscar, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that Mercedes will have to end up going for Kimi Antonelli, or might they bring in someone else as a temporary replacement? Do you think Verstappen is actually going to consider moves out of Red Bull?
I mean, to me, if Verstappen wanted to move, he seems like a driver with and with the whole team around him. You know, he seems like a driver with quite a lot of forward planning and, you know, seeing when a ship is starting to sink. And I don't think he will move, and I think Mercedes will go for Antonelli. Because, you know, you mentioned, I think Will did, about you know, the next Lewis Hamilton, and if Antonelli is showing signs of that to them, you know, that I think they will probably take the risk and go for it. Because when I think of who's available for a stopgap, would they really want to go Bottas again? Is that something that they would consider? You know, who else would you...
I did consider Bottas actually when looking at this question, but like whether he would actually want to make a move back to a top team like that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I mean Bottas. Not to get off topic, but he's struggled in the state car. He's probably looking for a way out. So I think if there was a stopgap solution, it would be Valtteri, but I feel like long term, and even now, I think they will put Antonelli in the car because he didn't have a great start to the F2 season, but he's really starting to pick up some steam now. I think as the Mercedes rumours have gotten louder, his performances have drastically improved from what I've seen of him. So I think they will stick Antonelli in that car, and we'll get an announcement very soon, I can imagine.
And certainly I think that if Verstappen were to go, obviously we've talked quite a bit about the instability that has seemed to be potentially brewing at Red Bull, with obviously the whole situation with Christian Horner and high up people in the team like Adrian Newey and Wheatley leaving the team. It still does feel a little bit like more would have to happen if Verstappen were to make that crucial decision, a little bit, because it seems it's kind of, I suppose, gone a little bit quieter until this release of Wheatley, and maybe even it would have to take the Red Bull car to have even more problems than what we've seen in the first half of this season for Verstappen to maybe look elsewhere. But we'll have to wait, as with all of these, until next season to see what the result is, to see if we maybe get that very shocking move of Verstappen to Mercedes, or whether they are going to go with someone else like Kimi Antonelli. But that's all the questions for this episode. Do you guys have any last thoughts on the season before we go into the second half at Zandvoort?
I just genuinely think this second half of the season, like, apart from the fact that maybe the Drivers' Championship is done outside of, I think Max would have to DNF twice and Lando win 2 races for it to be back on. But outside of that, I'm genuinely really looking forward to it, because I think we've got 5 or 6 drivers that could win any of the races. I think you'll see Ferrari come back a bit, because they tend to be better on the street circuits. And obviously we've got a few of them coming up into the later stages of the season. Mercedes obviously seem to be back. I think McLaren are always there. It's just up to Norris to iron out those mistakes, and Piastri does seem to be coming along really well. And you've obviously got Max Verstappen, who is likely to be a contender anywhere we go. And if you told me at the start of the season that there would be 7 race winners, and the first multiple winner outside of Max Verstappen would be Lewis Hamilton, I'd have bitten your hand off for this season, regardless of how it's kind of gone maybe overall in terms of the drivers' battle. But I'm really looking forward to it, and I genuinely think we're going to get one of the best second halves of the season in terms of races that we've seen in a long time.
Yes, certainly it is going to be very exciting, and it's certainly been a while. I think I've said this for quite a few races this season, where we generally have no clue who's actually going to be in front. And even with our predictions, it's been a while since we have had more drivers to pick from the race for the race win than can actually fit in our top 5, which feels very exciting. So we shall be looking forward to the race in Zandvoort. Just before that comes out, we'll obviously have a preview of Zandvoort. But until then, we will have another news episode, and we will be having a part 2 of this episode where we shall be looking at some and reacting to some more predictions sent in by our society for the second half of the season. But until then, thank you very much for Will Kingswood and Oscar for joining me. And until next time, goodbye.